Hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today and welcome. We're going to get started now as I think the audience is still slowly filing in. My name is Tariq. I'm Al-Shabaka's US Policy Fellow and the host of our Policy Lab series. So today we're going to be discussing Israel's assassination campaign against Palestinian journalists. As we all probably know by now, over the last 18 or so months, Israeli forces have killed more than 230 journalists, primarily in Gaza, but also in Lebanon and Syria. And to put that in perspective, that means more journalists have been killed during Israel's ongoing genocide than in both world wars, the US invasions of Vietnam and Afghanistan, and the war in Ukraine combined. These journalists are not being killed by crossfire. They're being deliberately targeted in a mass assassination campaign that is designed to prevent news of Israel's war crimes from reaching an international audience. And despite the scale of this, Western journalists and media outlets have largely remained silent. So in today's Policy Lab, I'm joined by Mariam Barghouti and Sharif Abdel Kouddous to discuss Israel's war on Palestinian journalists and how the complicity of Western media in normalizing these crimes is actually allowing Israel to get away with genocide as we speak. Mariam is a member of Al-Shabaka, and she's a writer and journalist based in the West Bank. She's been covering the region as a reporter and analyst for over 10 years now, and she's served as the senior Palestine correspondent for Mondoweiss, and reporting and analysis have been featured in places like Al Jazeera, The Guardian, BBC, and Middle East Eye, among many others. Sharif is also a journalist and now is the Middle East and North Africa editor at Dropsite News, based in New York City and Cairo. He has reported from across the Arab world and internationally for various TV and print outlets. So before we get into it, just a quick reminder about the format for today's discussion. I'm going to be posing questions for the first 50 minutes or so, and then we'll save about 10 to 15 minutes at the end to get to questions from you in the audience. So please feel free to submit your questions throughout the discussion. You don't need to wait till the end. By clicking Ask a Question, the Ask a Question button on the bottom of your screens. And remember, you can also vote on questions that you find particularly important or timely. And we'll do our best to get to as many of the questions as possible with the time that we have available in this hour. So let's get started. Mariam, I want to start with you. You've been reporting from the West Bank for a long time, so you've seen how Israel's assault on journalists is not new. For example, you reported from Jenin, where just 3 years ago, Israeli forces shot and killed Shireen Abu Akleh and tried to cover it up for years, and still are trying to do so. Can you tell us exactly how Israel's targeting of journalists has escalated over the past 18 months in both Gaza and the West Bank? And considering Israel's long history of targeting journalists, what makes this particular campaign unique compared to Israel's long history of attacks on the press?
Thank you, Tariq. So we witnessed the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh 3 years ago, which I think really set the precedent to what is happening now. Now, I want to remind that with Shireen, she is an American citizen as well. And as Palestinians, we really tried to draw on that to push for citizen rights, right? In policymaking and in rights in general, there's something for citizens that protects them. And we saw near non-existent accountability measures being pushed from the United States. And as we know, Palestinians have been getting murdered for decades. So Israel doesn't care, if Palestinians push for accountability. But what we saw in Gaza is that what happened with Shireen, and we saw the Israeli military try to make it seem that she was killed by Palestinians, despite forensic evidence showcasing otherwise. They kept trying to do that. And eventually they ended up with an apology for an inconvenience about her murder. And in Gaza, what we're seeing now is that escalated to complete impunity. Israel is not just executing journalists. They're creating a hit list of journalists they want to kill. Now, this is a state with a hit list of journalists that they want to kill. And this dramatic escalation also showcases this really significant moment in human history of just the violence that we're, as humans, we're capable of. And in this instance, the perpetrator is Israel. Now, in terms of what we have seen in the last 19 months in Gaza, it's very clear cut. It is execution of journalists, whether it's by bombs or bullets, or torture, because there have been journalists that were detained by Israel as well. And then in the West Bank, what we see is something slightly more sinister. So Israel is not executing journalists in the West Bank, but what they are doing is they're carrying out these detention campaigns. So they'll arrest journalists and keep them in detention indefinitely under administrative detention, meaning there is no crime against them, really. They're just keeping them out of the field, because the most important thing you have as a journalist is being on the field so you can relay the information. So they take them out of that. And that's not even mentioning that they're being subject to torture and ill treatment, where they're being denied food, they're intentionally being denied medical assistance when needed. They're also being denied things as simple as salt for when they have hypertension, for example. So Israel is really trying to break the Palestinian journalists, whether it's by detention or execution, or simply in the West Bank, just hurdling our access to locations. So they'll erect flying checkpoints across the West Bank at times where there is an escalation of military operations in Jenin or Nablus or Tul Kerem, whether it's in the north or in the south, areas like Hebron and Beit Lahem. So we can't reach the site on time. So it's very sinister. And I think what's really important to recognize is that this is happening. What is significant about this is that it is happening at a very significant moment. And at a time where we've heard international journalists say, let us go to Gaza, and appealing and writing letters and signing all these petitions that they want access to Gaza, but somehow in the West Bank, they're not covering, right? They have access to the West Bank. Most of their headquarters are in Jerusalem, and yet we don't see them covering. So Israel's targeting of Palestinian journalists is really an attempt to target the narrative. And you need to recognize that as local journalists, we have constantly been questioned about our credibility. We have constantly been questioned whether we follow protocol. And so the journalists are following the protocols. I would look at the evidence gathering of local journalists, and it's truly, it's bulletproof. Anyone that is just with the intention of finding out what's happening here can find it out. And these journalists are pushing out information as much as possible. It's just not being picked up by legacy media. It's not being picked up by the wires, which unfortunately is where many people still get their quick information from, right? So what Israel is doing, forget that this is a humanitarian crisis, forget that this is a crime against humanity. This is an engineering of absence. Israel is engineering the absence of Palestinians. It removes them from the narrative. It removes them from the historical outlining of the events that are happening and unraveling now. And they do this to manufacture consent. So in the future, when people are questioned, why didn't you do anything? They can just say, well, I didn't know, or I thought that this was happening. And it's this manufacturing of consent. So this is why this is significant and why Israel is doing it. It's not accidental, and it's not collateral damage. It's policy.
Yeah, thanks, Mariam. I think like what you say, it's manufacturing consent, and it's by removing these Palestinian voices, perspectives, cameras, right? You're leaving the only narrative as the Israeli narrative. And so when these stories do get picked up by mainstream, news and mainstream media, the rare cases that they are, it's the Israeli narrative that's presented, right? Sharif, I know you've done a lot. You've done a lot of work covering specifically Israel's assassination campaign of journalists in Gaza. Can you talk to us about some of the specific tactics that Israel employs to identify and assassinate these journalists? How they often attempt to justify their killing after the fact by smearing them as members of resistance organizations, resistance groups, and how these tactics align kind of with what Mariam was introing us to in terms of manufacturing consent that actually allows Israel to get away with the genocide that we're witnessing.
Yeah, I think we're living in a moment when both Palestine and journalism are coming under the most violent assault we've seen in generations. And those things are not coincidental, they're linked. Um, if we think of Israel as kind of the endpoint of imperialist capitalist power, kind of the future that awaits all of us, if it's not resisted, then Palestine and journalism in Palestine is also a point of resistance against that and exposure of it. And so the assault on Palestine and assault on journalism are very much intertwined. And we're seeing really, it's hard to contend with the level of violence, right? Journalists are being killed, they're being burned alive, they're being decapitated, they're being taunted and hunted, martyred. Um, and as Mariam mentioned, that's not to mention the journalists who have been severely wounded, disabled, and the journalists who have been exactly removed or subtracted from the scene, journalists who have been imprisoned. When we're talking about Shireen Abu Akleh, 3 years ago, such a well-known journalist who was killed in broad daylight, wearing her press vest, everything documented, it's on camera. There's eyewitnesses. There's no crossfire in the area. She also, it shouldn't matter that she has US citizenship, but it makes the US government responsible for her. So the imperial power that's funding and arming Israel should push for accountability. And still there's no accountability. That helped pave the way for this slaughter that we're seeing now. But two of the journalists that were with Shireen when she was killed are in prison. Mujahid Saadi, who wrote for Dropsite also one piece before he was taken in September. He remains in administrative detention, beaten badly upon his arrest. And I forgot his name, Mariam. Tell me. Who was just arrested.
Samudi.
Yes. He was just taken from Jenin. He's in his 60s. He's like a legendary Jenin journalist, a veteran. They call him like the living martyr. He was shot in the shoulder when Shireen was assassinated. He's been shelled before. They came into his house, beat him so badly he was hospitalized, and now he's in administrative detention. But I say this all to say that, Shireen's killing, lack of accountability, the lack of pressure from Western governments, and the lack of, I would say, pressure and also the editorial line of Western media institutions have all paved the way for what we're seeing that is happening to Palestinian journalists in Gaza right now. And what we're seeing is also things are changing, as Mariam mentioned. So I would say, so there's about 220 who have been killed in Gaza, which is just a shocking number. Many of them, they often just don't comment on the killing of journalists. They don't say anything. But what we started to see increasingly is that initially they would apologize, like with Shireen. First, they would say they didn't do it, right? That it was Hamas, like they did with Shireen. Then they would say they did it, but it was collateral damage and it was a mistake. And what we have increasingly begun to see, which is now kind of the norm, is that they admit to killing the journalists and they say that these weren't journalists at all, that these were in fact militants. And they keep crossing red lines with this. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So last July, I think it was 31, 2024, the Israeli military killed Ismail al-Ghul, who was a correspondent for Al Jazeera, in an Israeli drone strike that hit his car, decapitated him. They also killed his cameraman, Rami Rifi. Okay. After their killings, the Israeli military released a document supposedly saying that Ismail al-Ghul had received military ranking from Hamas in 2007. In 2007, Ismail al-Ghul was 10 years old. Okay, so even there's a sloppiness and a brazenness to their supposed justifications. Hamza Dahdouh, who was a cameraman and a journalist for Jazeera, and also the son of Wael Dahdouh, who was Gaza's bureau chief, Al Jazeera's bureau chief in Gaza. They lost multiple members of their family in airstrikes. In January 2024, Hamza was killed along with another journalist, Mustafa Thuraya, in, again, an Israeli drone strike on their car. I believe they were in Rafah. And you see kind of the same playbook again. The Israeli military keeps changing its story. In the beginning, it admitted it killed them, but it said it was a mistake. The spokesperson for the Israeli government said every journalist that dies, it's unfortunate. But they said that there was a drone. They were operating a drone in the area, and so they got confused and thought the drones were militants, and they hit them. Then, not much longer afterwards, the story started to change until eventually they claimed that Hamza and Mustafa were actually militants. Mustafa was, some commander in Hamas. Hamza was a member of Jihad. And then they produced, again, an almost laughable document claiming to back up their claims that Hamza was in some electronic engineering unit of Jihad's military wing. The document was like in Arabic and English. No one could understand why this document would be both in Arabic and English that they supposedly found, and no one took it seriously. But that was kind of became the norm. But what then they started to do is push this further, right? Is to, as Mariam mentioned, put journalists on hit lists. So preemptively say that they're going to kill them and hunt them. And they did this for the first time in October of this past October with Anas al-Sharif, Hossam Shabat, and 4 other journalists, all of them working for Jazeera Mubashir. These were 6 journalists, okay? And what's interesting, why these 6 journalists? These were 6 journalists. So the Israeli military said these 6 journalists are militants, and the spokesperson in Arabic for the Israeli military was openly, posting these videos saying that they're going to hunt them and kill them. All these journalists worked in the north, and there were some of the very few journalists that remained in the north throughout the 19 months genocidal assault. And they were at that time in October and November documenting a particularly brutal and vicious ethnic cleansing campaign in the north that was called the General's Plan. I don't know if people remember it. One can only imagine that this is why they were targeted. And they get calls from the Israeli military saying, stop reporting from the north, go south. Because they're exposing something that they want to happen in darkness because it's so brutal. On March 24th, Hossam said he felt like he was being hunted. On March 24th, Hossam was driving in his car in Beit Lahia, and they targeted his car. Both his legs were blown off. And he was killed. And what did the Israeli military afterwards proudly boasted that they had killed him and said, quote, don't let the press vest fool you. That's how brazen it's become. And then it went even a step further. This one is almost inconceivable. But Hassan Islayah, who is a veteran journalist in Gaza, all the journalists know him, respect him. He's been reporting for years. The Israeli military tries to kill him on April 6th. They bomb a media tent outside a hospital, kill 2 journalists, one of them burned him alive, and said that they hit that tent to try and kill Hassan because Hassan was a Hamas operative. Hassan loses 2 of his fingers, is burnt across his body, has a skull fracture, is receiving treatment inside Nasser Hospital. On May 13th, they bomb the hospital to kill a wounded journalist, admit that they did it, and it said the same line again. Don't let the press vest fool you. So we've reached a level. I mean, they are bombing a hospital to kill a wounded journalist that they tried to target before. This is inconceivable. And part of the reason that they can continue to do this is not just Western governments allowing it to happen, continuing to fund and arm, but that you have coverage of it in what we call legacy media or the mainstream media, but it's not the type of coverage that is required, right? When 2 people were killed outside a Jewish event recently in the States, an Israeli citizen and a US citizen, I got a breaking news alert on my phone, and it was huge news. How can this killing of Hassan, for example, bombing a hospital to kill a wounded journalist, not be breaking news? And because it's not covered like that, I'm not even talking about writing an editorial excoriating Israel for this murder. I'm just saying, just the way you frame your editorial coverage then means, yes, that most people probably don't know that this happened. It was buried. They'll repeat always the claim that Israel puts in, he was a militant. They'll just have it in there, the both sides thing. And so I think this is complicity in death and murder, and and it's not stopping. It's only getting worse.
Sharif, I want to stick with you for one more component of this question. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of, I mean, over the past more than almost 2 years now, Israel hasn't faced any measure of serious accountability for anything it's doing. So in your reading, like why do they even go through the bother of these smear campaigns after they assassinate journalists? Why not just kill them and move on to the next one if they're not facing any accountability whatsoever? Do you think it's tied to making it so that mainstream media can't discuss it? Just by putting those allegations out there that these journalists are involved in combat activity, that means, is that why, like, just because of those allegations exist and are made by Israel, is that why these mainstream media outlets aren't commenting about it? Is that why Western journalists aren't, responding the way they would if this was a massacre campaign of journalists in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that there's different levels to that question. Israel, when it killed civilians too, it also sometimes it always says it's investigating. And part of this has to do with legal mechanisms under international law. Does this actor have a justice system that can investigate itself? And so they always say they're investigating. There's never any accountability, of course, but this is intentional. And even the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, maybe I think about 10 years ago, decided to stop cooperating with any Israeli military investigation. They would often investigate killings and furnish the evidence to the Israeli military or whoever's investigating, a judicial body, in the hopes that there'll be some accountability. When they finally began to realize that they called it a legal iron dome, that this was just being used as a smokescreen. And so they refuse now to cooperate at all because there is no intention for any kind of accountability. Why does the media swallow wholesale what Israel's saying? Or maybe they don't swallow wholesale, but they will not treat Israel's claims with the same level of skepticism as they would other countries, for example, Russia, or even some of its allies in the Middle East. If the Egyptian government said something about the killing of a journalist, I think they would treat the claim very differently. But this goes much deeper into the atmosphere, the way that legacy media in the West covers this issue, right? And I mean, I've spoken about this before. It's they don't have to censor themselves, so why are they doing it? They're not being told to do it, and it's more that their span of kind of coverage does not fall outside of the span of political debate in Washington for any issue, really. They are kind of mostly think about topics in the world and adopt establishment orthodoxy in this way, where they're not even realizing it, I think. Like what water is to fish. And so on some issues, mostly social issues, reproductive rights or gun rights or LGBTQ plus rights, you'll see kind of much more breadth of coverage and critical coverage, and because there is breadth in Washington on these issues. But on foreign policy in general, capitalism in general, certain issues, there's consensus in Washington on certain things. And there's no topic that there's more consensus in Washington than Palestine, that they back Israel. That's starting to crack in different ways because of the level of violence and so forth, and just the way politics are changing. But that's very much the case. And that is reflected in the coverage then that we see. And yeah, it's deeply, deeply troubling. I find it shameful. I've been fortunate that documentaries I've worked on, that mostly Palestinian journalists have worked on with me, have won awards. I go to these award ceremonies, and there is an acknowledgement of Palestinian journalists being killed, but they never say who killed them. At the same award ceremony, there was a lot of talk about Evan Gershkovich, because the Washington Post won an award, and he was wrongfully imprisoned, and he should be free, and he is free. But it was all Russia, 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 Russia. And I find myself not wanting to be in this room with these people who are supposedly my colleagues, but it doesn't feel like they're my colleagues at that point, because it feels like if someone, Abdel, were to target Mariam, because she's a Palestinian journalist working in Palestine, there would just be less outrage over her killing, and people would care less. And so it doesn't feel like this is my community, actually. But there is a great radical independent media ecosystem that is everywhere, not just in the States. It does cover Palestine in a real degree. And I think we're seeing a real backlash, for the most backlash I've seen against legacy media over this topic than I've ever seen. So there's kind of almost weekly protests in front of the New York Times now, because it's been so blatant. People have resigned from the New York Times. The poetry editor resigned, and other people have stepped down. Someone refused a Pulitzer because of the media institution, Stanford's Mona Shalabi. So anyway, these things are cracking, but they're very much part of the ecosystem.
Thanks, Sharif. Mariam, I want to get your thoughts on kind of the same topic. I mean, you work with these journalists all the time. These are your colleagues as well. And from your experience, what have they told you about? I mean, have you spoken to Western journalists based in the U.S. or Europe about this, and what do they say when confronted on that? And I guess so. That's like one question. And the bigger question is like, what impact is their silence on this issue having on Israel's ability to get away with genocide in the long run?
Right. So I have spoken with my so-called peers on this, and what I've heard is a very defeatist mentality. So they would say, it's the editors, so we can't, or they would say, I really want to, but I would get censored. This is the good ones. There are others that would just blatantly, side with the oppressive side. And, as a journalist, you're supposed to serve truth, not power, right? You're supposed to reveal, not obscure. So for me, I saw a very defeatist approach from them, or it's not just complicity, it's an aiding and abetting of Israeli crimes at this point. Places like the New York Times have admit to things like that their reporting had contributed to building a case for the invasion of Iraq in 2003, right? This came way later on, but they have admit. So, and at the same time, they didn't change their policies. They didn't have a reflective process on how to avoid this in the future. Instead, they kept repeating it. And it goes back to show you how this is a pattern of abuse. Just like Israel will kill, deny, and then apologize at best. This is what these media institutions are doing as well. And for me, it's not just the silence, it's the outright denial that we are journalists, right? It's this constant negation of our profession as journalists. We're not seen as journalists to them because we don't adhere to these Western standards or editorial lines that they're accustomed to, that are censored editorial lines, right? Whether it's censorship by omission or censorship by manipulating and spreading misinformation at that point. And for me, the impact of this is it's not just on the public and the public's right to know, right? It's not just a violation. It's not just complicity in violating Palestinian rights. It's a violation of people's rights, the public's right to know things. And it has not just impacted the capacity for people to mobilize, because as we have seen, when people learn, when they really learn, they're in the streets, and they mobilize because their consciousness, won't allow this to happen. It's not just the fact that it has facilitated delayed consequence, and that's how war makers continue a war, through delayed consequences, right? But it's the fact that it broke us, or a part of us as journalists as well. Sharif was saying, he didn't know whether he's like sitting in that room with his peers, but it broke us because it makes you feel isolated and alone and abandoned, as a journalist, right? When there's silence from these so-called veteran journalists that work for these very big media institutions that are very important and significant in informing people, end up just not informing people, but also negating your existence. So this kind of it's a very layered impact, and it's very negative. But I think that it's important to also recognize that there are those that have a very defeatist approach in their profession. Again, they'll say, "Oh, it's the editor," or "We're not allowed to do this," but they won't push back. There are a few very brave ones that did, but overall, it's just there's no pushback. So for me, it's very disheartening, because you see journalism as though it's dying, right? And I think that's, yeah.
And I think talking about journalism, whether it's dying and the bravery and pushing back, how has the past 18, 19 months impacted Palestinian journalists? We still see coverage on social media of what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank coming out by Palestinian journalists who are, reporting despite everything. But Mariam, from your experience, how is this actually impacting specifically Palestinian journalists and Palestinian journalism as a field?
I mean, more than 200 of my peers were executed in Gaza. There is very few left that are trying to push out as much information as they can about how many times can they share the image of a child burning in flames, right? And in the West Bank also, there you see this exhaustion. Like I said, again, there were many international journalists that kept petitioning, "Let us into Gaza, let us into Gaza," again, as though there aren't journalists in Gaza, right? But at the same time wouldn't cover the West Bank, and it becomes exhausting as Palestinian journalists, because you're not just reporting this very ugly reality. You're not just risking your life. You can be shot, you can be arrested, you can be executed, but it's this inability to get the information out there. It's constantly censored. I have had to fight endless fights with editors to just get the information out, not just from the West Bank, but from journalists in Gaza as well. And the information is constantly denied or delayed, for that matter, delayed in publication, which is also criminal in these instances, because time is of the essence. And it's just exhausting and it's disheartening. But at the same time, I don't think the point is coming across that just because we're journalists, we're safe. On the contrary, it puts the target on our back, right? And when you're ignored in the scene where your peers are supposed to speak out, at the bare minimum, speak out for their other peers, and they're not, you're left alone. And we're not just left alone in a vacuum. We're left alone in front of one of the most violent and rogue regimes of this era, right? So we're not just in fighting this battle of narrative. We're literally in front of a gun, or a bomb, and that it takes its toll. And to lie and say we're brave, it's inaccurate. We're terrified. And everything we're putting out is just in hopes that it informs people to mobilize. We're not just hoarding and gathering and archiving information. We're trying to conjure change, but change has to come from people. And that's why where silence becomes complicity, because people end up knowing. And if you don't do something about it, then that's where the complicity comes in.
Thank you, Mariam. So over the past couple weeks, there does seem to have been a very gradual and far too late shift underway in how some mainstream outlets are covering Gaza. For example, the Financial Times wrote a piece that was more strongly worded than anything they've, and of course it still falls short in so many ways, but there does seem to be a slight shift ongoing at this point in the genocide. And is this an attempt to cover up their role in as complicit in manufacturing consent? Are they scared of possible legal action? What, Sharif, maybe we could hear your thoughts on this. Like, what's behind this very piecemeal shift in the rhetoric and the language that some mainstream outlets are using in their coverage of Gaza and the genocide?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, their coverage isn't monolithic. Most of it is quite ranges from wholly inadequate, sometimes extremely harmful and insightful, actually. And sometimes it's good. Like early on, the New York Times did a pretty important piece on the effect of 2,000-pound bombs. And they have the money to kind of do it with all these sexy graphics and everything, and that's good. But you should do that. And the power of these media institutions, like when the New York Times prints something on like the front page in the top right, like that is the most valuable real estate in journalism. It's the most powerful outlet in the world, really. And you saw at some point Biden even withholding some 2,000-pound bombs. I'm not saying it's because of that article, but like there is a real effect. But I think again we have to think of the way their editorial lines shift and flow, like the overall tone mirrors elites, right? And what we're seeing is that since the resumption of the full-scale genocide on March 18th in Gaza, and we're about to print something by Mariam on Dropside about the very deeply worsening conditions in the West Bank for prisoners since March. That's something that Abdel said recently, but also the scale of the genocide with a full spectrum blockade for almost 3 months. You're having mass starvation happening, just really relentless airstrikes across it's gotten so much that you have the leaders of France and the UK, and I forgot which was the third country, Australia, or no, Canada, coming out with a joint statement and saying this is too much. You even have Trump sometimes, he's very erratic and he has no kind of ideology, but sometimes will say, it's very bad over there, it's got to stop. Increasingly, Democrats in Congress speaking out more boldly, because even the Prime Minister of Italy, a far-right politician, said that this has gone too far. And then I think it's hard to know, chicken or the egg, which is leading which. But whether the media is leading that and helping that to come out, or vice versa, but they kind of are swimming in the same water. And so that's the reason I think we're seeing some of the coverage kind of change. Again, the New York Times, they're the first ones that published the video. They got the video first of the Red Crescent massacre. That was a very important piece, and they've continued to do important work on it. So yeah, I don't think it's so black and white as to, oh, we have to cover our tracks kind of thing. It's just it's also like the length. This has been going on for 19 months now, and if you look at the difference in the coverage in the beginning, very shrill coverage. You couldn't say anything that was even critical of Israel in any way, and you end up with articles that are claiming systematic rape by Hamas, and it's just a poor article on a journalistic level. Forget the ethics of what you're laying the groundwork for. That now has changed. Yeah, I would say it's changed because of the length and the scale of the violence, and because it's changed within elite institutions whether in Washington or elsewhere. It's also starting to change. So yeah, I think that's why it's reflected in the coverage so far. But again, I wouldn't say that specifically in the killing of journalists. I don't see the outrage yet. It's not there. Like after the killing of Hussein or Shabat or Hassan Aslayah, I don't mean to single those two out, but they're just so brazen. Both of them, both of the cases. There should be a front page news story about this, a big headline, or everyone wear black armbands, or put the headlines in black, like a black stripe on the thing. Do something. That we're not even seeing that. Hossam was reported that he was killed, but it was buried in a larger news story somewhere deep in the middle of an article. Also printed the claims that what Israel called him a militant. So I still harbor a lot of anger against these media institutions, regardless if their coverage is changing slightly.
And so with that in mind, and I think Mariam also raised the good point that while this has reached new levels, this also isn't entirely new. I mean, the New York Times manufactured consent for the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and they admit that, like Mariam said. Sharif, I'd like to hear kind of what you envision that this means for the future of news. I mean, we already know that a growing percentage of the population gets their news from social media and isn't really relying on the traditional outlets for their news consumption. But I mean, Dropsite is one example of a new independent platform that has been kind of going out there and doing this work. But can you tell us a little bit about what this means for the future of news and what you can predict that landscape is going to look like in a couple of years?
I've learned never to make predictions because I'm always wrong. But I can say yes, there has been, for a variety of reasons, not just Palestine, culturally a bigger rejection of legacy media. That has sometimes bled over into a rejection of kind of all media, all journalists, which is problematic. It's very important that Palestinian citizens are documenting and live streaming the genocide happening to themselves. But journalists provide an extra level of, they're incredibly important. There are protocols that we follow to make sure something's accurate and so forth. And I think that Dropsite has grown quite quickly, quite large. I think because we're filling a gap in just basic reporting from Gaza, okay, and Palestine in general. Just having journalists on the ground being able to publish. That's not happening in a lot of media institutions, or it's not happening enough. So it's hard to say. I think there is a growing movement that's supportive of independent media. I've worked in independent media most of my life, and it's in the States. It's changed in different ways. There was the indie media movement that grew out of the protests in Seattle in 1999, and there was a big rejection again of legacy media after they all helped beat the drums for war in Iraq, and they all did issue mea culpas later because they just were printing leaks from the White House saying that there was weapons of mass destruction without checking them at all, and then the White House would then quote them back. Oh, look, the New York Times is reporting the same thing. So, yeah, I think we're going to see. Hopefully, I would hope. I think it can go one of two ways. I mean, we can hopefully see more support for independent media outlets like Mondoweiss, like Dropsite, like Democracy Now! I'm talking about ones in the States now, that have covered this issue, and Electronic Intifada that have a record. If you look back, that their coverage was spot on from the beginning, actually, and it's not like, oh, we got this wrong, which is what mainstream media is doing. But at the same time, if this genocide ends and Gaza's destroyed and life kind of just goes on, and the mainstream media is like not held accountable for, or not culturally or actually for its coverage that helped this to happen, then we could be in a much darker moment of journalism. And yeah, it's hard to know. It's hard to know which way it will go.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the atrocities themselves happen again. It's that same cycle over and over again. So we have a couple good questions from the audience, and we only have about 10 minutes left. Mariam, I wanna ask you if you can talk about the NGOs and other civil society groups that engage with the mass detention campaign of journalists, mostly in the West Bank in this case, and just talk to us a little bit about some of the organizations to follow and how to potentially even get involved for those in our audience who can do that.
Yeah, I mean, the two really major organizations are the Palestinian Prisoner Society, and it's not just on journalists, but they have this massive database, and they follow up really on every detainee that they can. This is excluding those from Gaza, in which they're struggling with accessing information, but they also follow up on detainees from Gaza. But they have this massive update constantly on what's happening with detainees as well as Palestinian journalists. And there's Al-Damir that Sharif also mentioned earlier. Al-Damir also follows up on detainees and follows up on cases of journalists as well. So those two organizations are the ones I would recommend following. And then just follow, local journalists on the ground, constantly usually update on what's happening with their peers.
I would also add that Ad-Damir, I don't know if Palestinian Prison Society or not, but there were 6 Palestinian NGOs that Israel a few years ago labeled as terrorist organizations. And in a couple of, I think most cases, raided their offices, shut them down. They're still managing to operate, but probably those 6 are good to follow. Because they're doing important work, and that's why Israel's trying to shut them down. But it's like Al-Damir, Al-Haq, which does a lot of it's a legal rights NGO. But there's plenty. The ones who work on women's rights, unions. Who?
And then also what are some of the, I guess, the platforms to be looking out for? I mean, we've spoken about Dropsite, we've spoken about Mondoise, but are there other independent platforms that we should be paying attention to?
There's Sahat in English, and it's up and coming. There's also Al-Jarmaq News, also in English, also up and coming. I would say you can follow those as well as Mondowise, again, Dropsite. And, just if you follow, the thing is with Palestinian journalists, a lot of us are freelancing. So we're working for multiple outlets just because, the goal is to try and get the information out. So a lot of us are freelancing now. So you'll see multiple outlets. The New Arab is also doing a great job in taking on publications from Palestinian journalists as well.
Thanks, both of you. So there's another question about in the question section about we see the Hind Rajab Foundation opening cases, individual cases against Israeli soldiers for war crimes wherever they are. Do you guys have any ideas on why there aren't more foundations opening cases on the individual assassinations of Palestinian journalists? Because that seems like something that would be, again, an easy process to undergo by organizations like CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and so on. Do you have, maybe, Sharif, we could start with you, and then Mariam, would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think there's a difference between opening a legal case. Like, to my knowledge, CPJ doesn't file legal cases. Reporters Without Borders does. And then groups, independent, like legal groups, can file a case at the ICC or wherever. There have been a lot of cases filed, actually, with Palestinian journalists. Not all of them are so public. Whether, we're going to find accountability in that mechanism, I think, is another question. International law is a complicated thing that was constructed by the powerful, right? And I don't think anyone's under any illusion that this is some impartial, fair system. And we've seen it being increasingly chipped away since 9/11, where the most powerful country in the world is invading other countries illegally, is torturing people, rendering them, essentially kidnapping them, creating mass surveillance, openly torturing, in a prison camp on an island in an extrajudicial way. So and no one's being held accountable under this international human rights mechanism because it's a powerful country, the most powerful country. So, these things are being chipped away, but there's some of the smartest and most dedicated people I know work in this field. Noura Arakat, Diara Shammes, these are all human rights lawyers that operate within this rubric. They understand that this is what they're operating under, but there is this way of archiving and documentation when you're filing a case, and that you might get accountability, maybe in the future. And at the end of the day, there is something kind of refreshing that I can now write, and we do, at Drop Sites, we label Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, an international fugitive. Because he technically is. There's an arrest warrant by the ICC for him. The fact that he can travel to Europe and other countries and the United States, and that arrest warrant is not enacted, I think says everything about the system, the international order that we're in. But I still think these cases are important to be filed. And often the families of the slain, the families of the martyrs, do want these cases filed.
I would also maybe just add that journalists are being killed every other day, right? So that also necessarily hinders the capacity to push forward for accountability. So it's not, again, we also don't just want accountability for one or two or three journalists. We want for all of them, as well as all the 50,000 that were killed. And the fact that this is still ongoing makes it very difficult to carry out the investigative part of it, so you can push forward to a legal case, and have the necessary documentation, and also have the witnesses, right? A lot of the witnesses are still in the slaughterhouse, so that also impedes being able to go through with it strategically and systemically. But like Sharif mentioned, there are certain cases, but again, nowhere near what's needed yet.
And I just wanted to tell you something, Mariam. You said before you're not brave because you're terrified. I think the definition of bravery is that you're terrified, but you do it anyway. So you are brave.
Absolutely. I just have one more question for you guys before we close out. We only have a couple minutes left. I think I forget which one of you touched on this before, but a lot of this work is an appeal to the public, right? Is an appeal to public opinion. We are seeing public opinion shifts across the political spectrum around the world, and I think it's more. It's a more interesting story when it comes from the US and the West, because these are the populations that have been more historically entrenched in their pro-Israel views. But we are seeing this public opinion shift. But what we're not seeing is that shift in public opinion be translated to actual policy change. So with that in mind, with seeing the gap between how public opinion is not influencing policy, and how policymaking is becoming more and more insulated from public opinion. How does journalism have to change to adjust to that fact that policymaking remains very insulated from public opinion? Does that mean we have to, journalists have to be, different storytellers, approach storytelling in a different way? Mariam, we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
That's a really good question. And it's also something that I constantly think about. But there's also another issue that it's ridiculous that as journalists, we have to be investigative journalists to find what's happening in these policymaking rooms. It's not very openly available to the public when it should be. There isn't these transparency regulations that allows that. But more than this is I do think there should be a different kind of not just storytelling, but it's really interesting to me because for decades, international NGOs kept pushing for this development sector here and teaching Palestinians their rights and about international law. But I'm constantly flabbergasted that people in the West don't know their rights. They don't know how to politically engage in the different mechanisms of policymaking. And I think it's important that journalists begin informing the public in that. And that goes back to also local journalists abroad. So it's, we can just say, okay, you know what, don't report on Palestine or anything, but start informing the public on how they can effectively engage in policy making. Sharif.
Sharif, do you have any thoughts? We have like a couple more minutes and then I'll close out.
I'm trying to, I don't know if that gap is actually bigger. It's an interesting question. But in the run up to the Iraq War, we saw the biggest anti war protests preemptive before the war began in history, including in the United States. And that didn't change anything. There was pretty big anti war sentiment. I think this speaks to much larger issues of democracy in the United States and elsewhere, and how the machines of power actually work. Right? Are people actually accountable to voters? How does the system actually work? It's there is the myth that it's one person, one vote, and the person that represents you is there, but voting is a very, very blunt form of political expression. You, at the end of the day, find someone who sort of kind of represents some of your views as closely, and you vote for that person. That person's supposed to represent you in Congress or whatever, or in the White House. But right, democracy is all the other things. And I think there's a huge focus on voting and not a lot of focus, or maybe there is increasingly, on dissent and protest and getting your voice out that way. I think an important thing journalism has to do, and that a lot of the elements that we've talked about do, is to document dissent, is to publicize it, is to let people know that it's happening in the first place. These are not things that are usually covered by legacy media for many of the same reasons we've talked about. Acts of resistance, acts of protest, amplifying voices that otherwise wouldn't be heard. I think that way you can eventually affect policy. But, I think at this point, I've become so cynical about the media structure in the United States. Yeah, that's mostly, I've worked half my life there, half my life in Egypt or in the Arab world, but mostly reporting for outlets in the States. And the kind of mainstream media structure, I don't think can be changed at this point. I think it needs to be dismantled and replaced. And independent media will be one way of replacing it.
Thanks, Sharif. I think that's a good place to leave it off, as we're over time now. But thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks everyone for taking the time. Before we sign off, I do want to remind everyone that these policy labs are a crowdfunded program of Al-Shabaka. So we'd be super thankful for any contributions that you can make to us. And if you're able to donate, please do so by clicking the donate button that should appear somewhere on your screens. Thanks again, Sharif. Thanks again, Mariam. I hope to have you both on at some point in the future.
Thank you.